Welcome to our podcast, The Intended Parent, all about surrogacy. We want to open up the conversation in this space and also bust some of the myths that you might have heard about it. We're going to share our stories and those of others with heart and honesty. And not only do we want to educate, but also empower those who find themselves on this route to parenthood. We hope you enjoy listening.
Hi guys, I hope everyone is well. On this week's episode, we have got the wonderful Julianne Boutaleb online. Julianne and I have been talking via Instagram for, I would like to say, a good few years, and have never managed to get in the room together. So grateful to have you on our podcast today, Julianne. Julianne is a consultant perinatal psychologist. I will let her explain a little bit later what exactly her job is and how she supports intended parents and parents. Julianne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, we're almost in the room together, which is lovely. I think it's probably 5 or 6 years that we've been texting and DMing and all sorts. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here and almost in the room with you and Fran this morning.
We will get in a room at some point, I promise you.
I hold you to that.
Well, I hope you're all settled in and ready for a good old chit chat, because this is something that Fran and I talk about a lot, and emotional support is super important on surrogacy journeys. So how about we just kick off with the very first question? What is it that you do, and what sort of support do you provide to intended parents, and why is it so important?
Absolutely. So what a mouthful, consultant perinatal psychologist. So what that essentially means is that I'm an expert in the sort of from conception through to 1 year post-birth. But actually, I'm a specialist in what happens before conception, because of course, fertility and infertility, diagnosis, medical injury, whatever it is that changes your, planned route to parenthood is also what we can provide support around. So essentially, I'm now sort of really, really happy to be leading a practice. There are 16 of us all together across the UK. We offer online and face-to-face support for anyone really. And the tagline on the practice is for you, wherever you are on your journey to parenthood. And that essentially is the nuts and bolts of what we do. So we can offer individual therapy if it might be that you're at the stage in the journey where you're realizing that perhaps, IVF isn't going to be for you. It may be that you're at the stage where you're considering other paths to parenthood, including surrogacy or donor conception or even adoption. Wherever you are in your path to parenthood, we're able to offer tailor-made support for you as an individual or as a couple, or indeed it might be that you're already, considering surrogacy. And for example, we do joint assessments with commissioning parents and the surrogate if needed as well. We work in tandem a lot with very well-known agencies, such as Extraordinary Conceptions or Two Dads UK. So lots of those organisations might, when they come across people who are struggling, and obviously there are lots of different reasons why anybody would struggle along this pathway, that they might then say, actually get in touch, you'll be able to speak to these people. And what we have is an overall understanding in, what the steps are that you've taken if you are at the start of this pathway. We understand the emotional distress that comes from having to veer off a pathway. And as, often is the case with gay or same-sex couples, this is an expected path to parenthood. For heterosexual couples, it may be something that they're only tentatively seeking out and trying to think about. We can offer them support at that stage, or it may be that they're already pregnant and they're struggling with attachment issues, for example, to their unborn baby. Or it may be indeed that you're now parenting and you've come through the fog of all that you've come through to become a parent, and the reality, the shock of the reality of having the baby in your arms is what you need most support with.
Yeah, we're definitely going to cover a lot of those topics as we go through the chat and delve into them a little bit deeper.
It's interesting you were just talking about, the different paths and things there. Do you think it's important that once you've moved on to, let's say, a surrogacy path, you then forget about the other routes to parenthood? Do you think it's important to sort of pick one and focus on it? Because I've often heard that with adoption, that if you're going to consider adoption, you really need to have put behind you perhaps the chance of being able to carry yourself and be fully sort of in that space. Is that something that you recommend?
I don't know. I as a trauma expert, I don't believe, and I've written on this about reproductive trauma. So reproductive trauma is a term that was coined back in the 90s by reproductive psychiatrists in the States, Martha Jaffe and Janet Diamond. And what we know actually more about now is that it's very difficult to forget. What actually happens is a process called mazing, so that we know that you're going through a maze, and let's say your expected path to parenthood is, let's face it, the easy one. Why would you want to choose this path to parenthood if you didn't have to? But that, you basically have sex with a partner and you get pregnant and have a baby. It may be that you go down that path and you realize that path closes off. And then, through different ways, through IVF, through unfortunately pregnancy loss, through sustaining an injury, indeed through illness, the paths become closed off. And then it might be that you're standing in front of this path that you've never considered and feel it's very difficult to consider, because let's face it, it's not often a chosen path to parenthood for heterosexual couples. But the closing off, I think, happens in different levels. It might be that cognitively you're closing off, you're saying, okay, we're making our decision to move forward down this path. However, what actually happens is that often people are going back and forward over the decision for many, many months, maybe even years, before they're able to make peace with the decision and move forward. And that's something that's not very well considered or thought about within clinics or within the wider surrogacy pathway.
It's a lot easier to say, isn't it? Like, oh, just move forward with this path and make sure that you're not thinking about that anymore than it actually is that it is doing it.
I think that's almost, that's with any trauma at all, isn't it? Like, I have this weird thing in my personal life at the moment, and someone just said to me, "Oh, well, try and forget the hard stuff and just remember all the really good stuff." And I'm like, yes, I'm fully aware of that, but I can't ignore the tragedy that's unfolded in my life. Like, you just can't. And I guess it's the same when you're going through this infertility journey. You need to sort of, acceptance is the word that comes to me, is that there's a lot of sort of acceptance work that needs to go on.
But I don't think it ever finishes. This is a message I'm very passionate about putting out there. So it may be that you've absolutely come to the decision that surrogacy is the path for you. However, it might be when, the surrogate becomes pregnant, suddenly you have this wave of grief and you're going, what am I grieving? What am I crying for? Isn't this, good news? And often what I'll say to people is, yes. But this is, of course, a very obvious reminder of what you've not been able to do. How can you not feel grief as well as relief?
I still feel like that every time somebody announces a pregnancy, and I think, I've got two little girls who are everything to me. But every time somebody announces a pregnancy, I still have that sort of sense of loss. And think, I really wish that I could have done that, or I still could do that, and I still had that option to do it, and had that choice.
And Fran, this is what I feel really strongly about, that the idea that we don't carry ambivalent feelings, and I think this is what's really shocking. I think the idea that you choose this parenthood, you've got to be 100% on it, both of you. Any wavering, oh gosh, maybe we don't want to do this. Any doubt. That's not what happens. What actually happens is that you can move forward in the decision. And let's face it, these decisions are often made in very emotional circumstances. It's often through recovery after illness or recovery after, trying to extract, sperm, or trying with, donor eggs. These are very long, prolonged journeys, including loss and so on. So the idea that this loss just goes away is not true. It reverberates throughout the journey, and it comes up at different times. It might even come up at the time where you're trying to help your little one understand how they came about, for example. You're reading a story, you've read it 500 times, but there's one time you feel choked because they've asked a question in a different way. They want to understand more about, who the surrogate was or who the donor was. These losses reverberate through the journey to parenthood. And I want that to be a really clear message this morning. Just because you're feeling these losses doesn't mean that this was the wrong choice. It means there are certain experiences that you never got to have that, of course, you still feel the loss of. And regardless of that, you can be a good enough parent.
It's interesting you said that, because just a couple of minutes ago, you said, when we were talking about this, you said, people won't choose. This isn't an easy route, and you don't choose to sort of have parent children through surrogacy. But I was listening to a podcast this week, and it was, from two people who do have fertility privilege, as I call it. And they said, oh, yeah, well, maybe I would do surrogacies to avoid putting my body through it. And yeah, it sounds like a good option, actually, because, it'd be easier for me. And, I'm just sitting there thinking, God, I think maybe every single human being needs to be counselled on the impact of having a child through surrogacy and the lasting sort of imprints of that journey, because it certainly isn't the easiest way to do it, even though you think for 9 months you're going to avoid pregnancy. In this person's case, it's so much more, and it runs deeper than that, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that's the focus. And let's be honest, I think the fertility industry over focuses on this, which is on the baby. Hooray, we've got the result. Of course we have, but we can't erase everything we've gone through to meet that baby, because all of those things have changed us. There's a whole process that I talk about, which is sort of reimagining your journey, reimagining yourself as a parent, reimagining, what attachment is going to be like if, you haven't carried the baby, or you haven't had close proximity, or you haven't birthed that baby. So what has to happen is, as surrogate parents, as intended parents, we have to really widen our minds and reimagine all of these things for ourselves and for our children. And so those sorts of comments that you overheard in the podcast, for me, is the opposite of reimagining. All they have in their mind is baby equals result. And of course it isn't. Now, the positive thing I want to put across this morning is that a lot of those things that, anybody goes through, and, to have a baby through surrogacy can lead to amazing results. I think there are clearly, and this is the research of Professor Susan Gollenbach, University of London, and she has shown that parents are often more committed. Fathers in particular are more involved. There is a real sense of gratitude on the good days, and let's be honest, not every day, but there is a real sense of gratitude, of appreciation, of wonderment at who our children are and who how they came about, but also greater openness also with the children, because often intended parents, and this is donor conceived parents as well, have to have really difficult conversations from very early on. Now, guess what? What that means is that if you're able to, and you feel equipped enough to have these conversations, often you're having very, very strong attachment and bonding experiences with your children from very early on. You're talking about how loved they were, how long you waited for them to come, perhaps a little bit about what you went through to have them, and, how important they are in your life. And these are huge gifts of parenthood. And I know later on, Karina, you want me to talk about the struggles, and I'm very glad to do that. But I think we have to hold on to the unexpected gifts that these paths to parenthood can bring as well.
Yeah, I've got really emotional listening to you. Yeah, well, no, because I think Fran and I are both about to cry, but I don't know, naturally we sort of think of, maybe because I talk about this, that quite often we're sort of brought into a space where our surrogates are our saviour, and as a result we're sort of made to feel not intentionally but slightly inferior because of what we've failed to do. And what you've just said there about actually the children we're raising are being raised in homes where the love it's just a different type of love. Sometimes we forget about that, and we beat ourselves up about all we couldn't do.
I think there's so much focus sometimes, isn't there, as well, on the negative sides of it, and what you miss out on.
Yeah.
perhaps, we don't talk enough about actually
Yeah.
what we get. I mean, I guess, I've talked about the fact that not many mums see their children being born from the business end, which
Yeah.
and in a state that is you're totally aware, you're not drugged up, you're not in pain, you are there at that. But it's really nice. I think we need to talk about that more. We need to talk about the stuff that you get that actually having a normal birth you don't get.
No,
Yeah,
and I think this is a double-edged sword as well. So this knowledge is what people like you and Karina use to beat yourselves up. And what I'm saying is, whoa, can we, use a softer brush? You should be actually, saying well done as well, because what this means is it turns motherhood on its head. So who are you as a mother if you haven't carried your baby, you haven't birthed your baby? Then you have to find a new definition of what mother means. And then what that opens up is it's all about the relationship. It's about your parenting. It's about the impact. So it's all about nurture. Because the nature bit, apart from the fact that you may have a genetic link, is not going to be heavily on your side. So the beauty of this journey is that it's all about nurture. This is what makes you the unique imprint on your children's lives, the attachment relationship you build with them.
Yeah.
And whilst I know many of you beat yourselves up in not being good enough in that, I guess what I want to talk more about this morning is that no, that is your strength.
It's interesting because I think we both do realise how incredible, and we do say, like, even with the surrogacy journey for definitely for me, it was very much me who went after it before my husband really was on board, because he was probably living in his own sort of bubble of thinking, we'll make it work somehow. So there was, and I do often say, actually it took one person to really get into the driving seat and start steering our way down this road. So I think I do acknowledge the incredible work and effort that I've put in, but there's still a trauma trigger of, I didn't do certain things. And as much as I celebrate the difference, the beautiful things we did and the surprises for everyone that we made, because like Fran was at the business end, we kept Tamala's birth a secret and delivered these beautiful surprises to all our families. We did very special things to honor and celebrate the way we became mums, but there's just still that piece of you that is still grieving the pregnancy and the birth, and I guess I always I'm harboring it, and it's affecting me, because when you talk about the beautiful parenthood journey, it's still reducing me to tears.
But I wonder if it's important for you to understand that might not just be trauma. Because I work with the whole gamut of parents, that come through fertility journeys. And one of the things that I think we often do to our own trauma is that A, we dismiss it, and B, we mislabel it. I think what you're feeling, it is, yes, partly grief, but it's also, I think, joy. Like these feelings don't sit in different places. They come through in the same way. And I think what I often experience, and I'm an IVF mom, but, I also experience through my clients, is that these feelings are often mixed up together. It's that moment where you realise, am I the only mum again crying at the Christmas concert, or the only mum, spending X amount on the 5th birthday party, And that's the mix of these emotions. Yes, you could argue, it's the trauma coming through, but actually it's the appreciation also. I almost didn't have this. How lucky am I? And as I say, you cannot hold yourself to that every single day of the week, because let's face it, parenting is a lot messier than that.
I think as well, like you can, as much as you tell yourself these things sometimes as well, actually hearing somebody else say it, is just different, and I guess it sort of validates it in some ways, which sort of then leads me on to what my next sort of question is, and I've maybe sort of answered it myself, is that I didn't have any counselling really. I've never had any counselling since my cancer diagnosis, and I talk to my mum an awful lot, and me and Karina sort of chat. I went to a little group for a while, which was really useful. I never necessarily thought I needed it, but then I'm thinking maybe I did need it. What could you do to not necessarily convince? I think that was the wrong word, but why do you think it's important for yourself, for your family to have some sort of counselling when these things
there
happen?
are different reasons. Look, sometimes what can happen, there's all different things that could possibly happen on this journey. Sometimes I see couples that are clearly coming apart where, and there's been research around this with De Montfort University have shown that heterosexual fathers through the surrogacy journey often feel very left out and often left to do practical things, really worry that they're going to get in the way of the surrogate and, the intended mom. So sometimes they might come to me on their own going, I don't know what to do. I'm sort of letting her drive it all, but actually I'm feeling really estranged from the baby and I've got the genetic link. So that might be one potential place. The other thing is that we know in the research that cumulative trauma can impact, and what actually happens is we often go into freeze mode. So, and you ladies will know this, how do we get ourselves through years and years and years of trauma? Often we go into fight, flight, but more often than not, we freeze. So we compartmentalize, we get involved in doing, we get involved in keeping the eye on the prize. Once the prize is in our arms, that's often when we start to unfreeze. And so more often than not, with people who've gone through lengthy fertility journeys, they'll say to me, why am I depressed now? How come I didn't get depressed when I had the cancer diagnosis? Or how come I didn't get depressed when... Because actually the keeping on going, the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, that drive that, got you to here has run out. Mission accomplished to a point, but that's when the feelings show up, when it's safe in your body and mind for them to do so. So unfortunately, there is a higher incidence of postnatal depression, postnatal anxiety, and PTSD. Because let's face it, sometimes these babies can be in NICU, or, in your case, Karina, multiple birth is more common. So again, these factors, depending on the factors postnatally, there may be, a higher incidence of these sorts of psychological issues. Now, there's another thing I want to add. Across about 40 years of research in the transition to parenthood, regardless of how you come to it, there is one variable that really dictates whether or not you're more likely or less likely to have psychological issues. And that is the availability of social support. I think the intended parenting community is really missing that link. Now, you've both said you've reached out for each other, you reached out for your mum, Fran, but that mirroring back, you two have an acute knowledge of what it's like to have your children like this. But often intended parents find themselves stranded, not quite sure where they belong in terms of, the great unwashed parents that they can now gain access to, or is it within the fertility community, where do I belong? Do I sit in with the donor conception people or with, the IVF? And that lack of a community and lack of a sort of a very tailor-made community can also be a factor for many intended parents.
I can see that as well, because, we've created this Facebook group, and I sometimes think, I think people need to be confident to be able to talk in that space. But I often think that with intended parents, especially ones who are still maybe actively looking for a surrogate, or at the beginning of the journey, there's this unsaid level of competition as well, because there's a lot more intended parents out there than there are surrogates. And if you're trying to find a surrogate through the same Facebook group that you're all on, trying to support each other, there's that other layer of complication as well, isn't there? And how do you find support from somebody who, is in some ways your competition? I know that's how some people see it.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I find within both the intended parent community and wider fertility communities is sort of survivor's trauma. So where you think you're lucky enough to have the surrogate, to be in, moving down that path, and you're feeling guilt for the other person. Or you then start to lose the support you had, because guess what? You've got the surrogate and they don't. And then you're stranded again. So I think there's very common experiences for intended parents of being isolated emotionally, not being safe enough often to talk about how they're really feeling, both within the communities that they're talking to, the Facebook communities, but both within their wider friendship and family circles. How much of this do I actually share with them? Because I'm actually trying to sell it to them. I'm trying to say to them, don't worry about those misgivings. I find this with the donor conception community as well. Myself and Becky have made little videos about, how to talk to friends and family. Because more often than not, and I'm sure you guys will agree, you're probably not sharing the most awful bits of this experience, because you don't want them to say, listen, do you think this is the right path for you? So you're doing this very confusing, almost dividing up of yourself, where you're selling it gung-ho. You're even, as you say, Karina, you're possibly in the driving seat when maybe your partner isn't. But what do you do with all the other feelings? The nights where you think, oh God, is this really for me? Or who do I talk to about the fact that I don't know if the surrogate is right? So this divided self idea is something that Ruth Olshansky talks about. And it's very common for women going through fertility treatment, where they hide their true feelings about what happens. And again, what I often see clinically is those true feelings might pop up once the babies have arrived.
I think that's so true, because I remember when we had the boys, and actually before we had the boys, and we had an unmatch from our surrogate who carried Amala, and we had to find another surrogate. And I know Fran's got 2 children carried by the same surrogate, but there's huge guilt when you go on a sibling journey as well. There are other IPs out there who don't have a single child, yet I'm now using a surrogate to have more than one child. I felt so guilty at that time. And then when the boys were born, I definitely, sort of leading back to what you said earlier, I even remember saying it to, I think I might have said it to Fran, that I feel like I went through a sort of postnatal depression that no one understood, because, people look for the key signs of postnatal depression in the person who's given birth or whatever else. And I remember the health visitor coming around, and she just said to me, oh, were they feeding all right, blah, blah, blah. I looked at the boys and said, oh, yeah, they were carried by surrogate, weren't they? Okay, oh, that's fine, I'll go. And she didn't ask me how I was. And I was carrying such weight at that point. I had 3 brand new babies who'd spent 10 weeks in neonatal. I hadn't birthed them. I didn't share genetics with them. They'd landed in our household so vulnerable. But I felt like I couldn't say that I was struggling, because I had to be so grateful for the fact that my surrogate had carried them for me, and we'd found a route to parenthood. And even now, I think that's a huge, issue, that it's very difficult once you've become a parent to go back and acknowledge all of those points of immense stress.
I remember that post when you posted it. It was so powerful. It was probably the only time I've ever seen anybody be that vulnerable and honest, Karina. And I feel passionately, however we come to motherhood, it is a bloody struggle. Whether you've adopted, whether you're an auntie who's standing in for, the birth mother because she's ill, whatever. We have, and look, both of you, I'm Irish, you've got Indian background, Karina, I don't know your background, Fran, but I've seen people mothering children that aren't their own all my life. I've been mothered by women who have and don't have children. And I really wish we could blow this idea out of the bathwater that you're only a mother if you've been pregnant and birthed. That's not true. That's really not true. We see the same brain changes in adoptive mothers, in intended parents. We see the same brain changes, which is when you're heavily involved and caring for little ones, your brain goes through specific changes. In other words, our babies, by virtue of mothering our babies, we are changed. And the changes are increase. Up here, the amygdala is a little part of the brain that's very conscious of risk. So we become more anxious in those early first few weeks and months. That is going to be multiplied, Karina, if you've had babies in NICU, or indeed if you have multiple babies. We also have, so this idea that you're a mother instinctually, no. Research shows you learn to be a mother. Your brain changes on the job. So again, what we notice is frontal cortex changes linked to visual processing of babies' faces. So when we show mothers versus non-mothers pictures of babies, this particular part of the brain lights up. That's to do with the experience of mothering a baby. Yes, some of these things start in pregnancy. Some of them are accentuated in birth. But it's the hands-on mothering of a baby that makes you a mother. Have I said that clearly enough, or should I actually emphasize that again?
I'm just wondering. This is sort of switching it around the other way as well, and because I know I'm going totally out of order with the questions now, but I know that we talk about. We've talked about how women who go through surrogacy worry about bonding with their baby, and I think you've you've answered that in part. The other way, like reversely, what about the baby? Do we know much about the baby, and then how the baby thinks about who is its mother? Is it the woman that's given birth and that's carried the baby for 9 months, or is it the woman that then nurtures it once it's? Do they know the difference, or the dad? What do we know much about that?
We know some things. So we do know, depending. I mean, there's a whole area of epigenetics, and I'm not an expert in epigenetics, but we do know that there are early pre-verbal experiences in the womb that babies carry with them. And you know, at the very basic level, we know, for example, that stress hormones can cross the placenta. So what you really want is, you know, a surrogate who is able to stay regulated and relaxed and calm, that you have a good relationship with. And again, sometimes I see instances where, and I have actually seen surrogates themselves for support, where they're in very non-amicable situations with intended parents, and you just think, gosh, this will impact the baby, you know, because we know there are epigenetic things that are laid down in utero. So that's the honest answer. There's no getting away from that. And we know that babies are also impacted by their births. But we also know, as with non-gestational parents, that there are ways in which the intended parent can be known also to the baby, you know, in terms of voice, in terms of stroking. We know that because we know in heterosexual families, that's what dads do. And we also know how important dads are in the hours after birth and how quickly they can be imprinted on their babies' brains as well. Babies are born, if you can imagine, with hundreds of thousands of neurons, none of which are joined up. So whilst some of that is impacted in utero, the actual joining up of the neural pathways happens in the first 3 years of the baby's life. And that's the nurture bit. That's where you come in. The story about how they came to be and who the surrogate mother is in their story, again, that's up to you to give them. We need stories, and these children need stories to make sense of how they've come about. And as you know, again, Professor Susan Gollenbach, she's written a fabulous book called We Are Family, and the longitudinal studies clearly show that where that disclosure, that telling and talking, giving to our children of these stories early on, any residual negative impacts are not there in the long term. However, do children ask? Yeah. Do they challenge? Yes, they certainly do. And I've done some podcasts with Paths to Parenthood where it's predominantly donor-conceived parents. And of course, it's that question, you're not my mom, you know, or I don't love you, you're not my mom. everybody lives in dread of the teen years. But again, what's really important, and maybe this is something that we could talk about together, Fran and Karina, it's about understanding the surrogacy journey at each stage of your child's life. They will be taking on the story you've given them and reworking it and remaking it for themselves as well, as they should.
I think it's fascinating, but I think it probably is a whole other episode, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
No problem. If you want me to come back, I can definitely come back.
Definitely on the courses. I think we as part of our offering, we are offering more sort of support than the podcast in terms of sort of courses that we want our intended parents to be able to subscribe to. And I think this is a topic that we must get on there. And you are already on our list for people to contact anyway, Julianne. But I just think it's so important and God, so thought-provoking, the conversation. I mean, we are totally off script at the moment. I don't even know where we're at with our with our scripted questions, but let's figure a way back to them. I'm slightly mind blown at the depth that we've covered in our first 30 minutes.
Well, actually, I think it's me, and it's just asking about the similarities and differences that you see in general from couples who have come to this through years perhaps of IVF that hasn't worked, people who, like myself and Karina, find out overnight that their infertility is gone, and same-sex couples who I guess have just got a completely different set of difficulties that sort of surround them. So just what are the similarities and differences in those?
That's
are there any things that stand out?
But I mean, I would say,
is that a whole other podcast?
It probably is. But I would say that the least trauma. I mean, look. So I'm going to give you some research. So what we know is the longer the fertility journey, the more impacted you are likely to be psychologically. Okay. Now, what that may entail, and we know for same-sex couples, that may entail, having to come out to a boss, having to come out to your family, arduous journeys abroad, having to find, a surrogate that will agree to the situation, having to go through legal loopholes, etc. Money. These are all stresses that, all intended parents are going to go through. However, if you add in a protracted infertility journey whereby, you've had other pregnancy losses, or you've tried IVF numerous times and failed, I think we can all agree, can't we, that that's likely to cause more psychological impact in the long run.
I mean, we've said this before, that even though that the cancer was something that we needed to deal with, actually just having that overnight, this is not a way that you're going to become pregnant anymore, you're going to have to look at something else, in some way was easier than years and years of struggle where you're still not quite sure of, is it going to work, is it not going to work, why is it not going to work, all of those questions. Just for us, it was like, it's not going to work, you need to move on. There wasn't,
but it's also the
no
losses, it's the accumulation of losses. Clearly your cancer diagnosis was a loss, but if you were to add in becoming pregnant and losing that pregnancy, or and I know, Karina, you've had particular losses along the way as well. I mean, the loss of embryos and different things that happened as well. So the more accumulation of losses, then the more, unfortunately, the more traumatic and the more impact the journey will have. However, again, the leveler is support. So if you can get support for yourself along the way, it's really important that you can, because the more you're able to shore up support and, come through supported, that is the leveler of, the sort of the impact of the trauma.
I remember we had a conversation once with a same-sex couple, and it felt like they entered surrogacy from a place of joy. It was almost like a real celebration of the relationship, and it's very different to the perspective of a heterosexual couple who enter the surrogacy world, and it was very interesting to sort of hear it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the other thing I would add is this idea of mazing. most heterosexual couples come in at the point where it's assumed. And this comes back to this reproductive story. So, little boys and girls will play mummies and daddies. There is already an assumed story that perhaps, same-sex couples have to let go of anyway. I also work with solo parents, and they have to let go of that part of the story as well. If there's not going to be a partner, but I can still have a baby. Heterosexual couples are still holding onto those assumptions, whether they know it or not. I've met, my hero. I've met the person I want to settle down with and have babies. This is never the bit that we imagine, that we're going to need to have another person, to have, either a donor or a surrogate. This is not the assumed reproductive story. The other thing I feel about this is that we aren't shown examples of this to normalise it. I just looked on Netflix last night. There's something called The Surrogacy.
Oh
and I
my
just
God.
went, yuck. Or there was
Yeah.
The Nest 2 years
Yeah.
ago.
Oh,
Again,
that drove me
yuck.
mad.
So all of the ways that these journeys are portrayed are sensationalist. They are, they play on the not normal of this journey. And that's the other thing I feel strongly about. It's, can we start, how in God's name are you going to feel this is a valid path for you if all you see are these sensationalist storylines? So part of reclaiming the reproductive story is, and I always say this, if you can see it, you can be it. Can we start seeing more realistic stories, different reproductive stories that involve a surrogate?
That's in the top of every podcast we say, the reason we start this is to share surrogacy from the perspective of the girl next door, to break the sensationalisms and the stigmas that are thrown out there from people who don't even have a lived experience of it. And that's, I guess, why we're here today, because it's all about, making sure people can see what this path to parenthood looks like.
Exactly.
If you choose surrogacy in the UK, and if you choose it independently, because even within the surrogacy world, you then get the sensationalism around, oh, don't do it on your own because you're not protected, and we're so tired of it, because our 6 children are a testament to this path to parenthood, and we want to make sure that people aren't, being excluded because they're afraid.
And you two are also a testament to this path to parenthood.
Thank you. I think we've covered, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was this thing about blended families. And, personally, I remember when we sort of had to, we did lose those embryos, and we did lose that chance of, me having a second child with my genetics, and were thrust into this donor conception journey. And it was very much overnight. Again, it was like, well, I had embryos and now I don't, so now what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to have to look for an egg donor. There wasn't a long period of trying and realizing that it was unviable eggs or anything. That was our problem. I know that I felt like, what if I love Amala more? What if I bond more, have a bond with her that I don't have with the triplets? We then had a COVID pregnancy, which meant I wasn't as active in the pregnancy as I was with Amala's pregnancy. So, and that second journey, there was a lot of fear around connection because of donor eggs, and then connection because of a surrogacy pregnancy where I'm not actually involved. We didn't have the touching the belly and all of that sort of stuff. What's your advice to people who are going through sort of, donor conception and surrogacy at the same time, and potentially creating a blended family off the back of it?
Yeah, I think, and I'm glad you've said that within these wider parameters, that this is a particular journey. I think you have to allow yourself grieve the loss. And I think it is a loss, because whatever your previous experience and previous child, that is the experience that sort of normalizes this path usually. And I think to have to stretch yourself even further beyond what you've found comfort in, what you've found, where you've rested finally, you've had your first child, this is what it feels like, to then have to come back and again reimagine, reconsider. That is a huge stretch on anybody psychologically. So I would say, first of all, recognize that. If you don't recognize it, I think it comes up in other ways, perhaps when you are struggling to bond. with your second or third child. We have a phrase for this in parent-infant psychotherapy. We call it the ghost in the nursery. It's sort of the elephant in the room, if you like. That often, if you aren't aware of the difference in blended families, you start to hang things on the genetic link, or indeed the lack of the genetic link. So it might be you think, I just don't feel the same about Freddie as I do about Susan. Or maybe it's because I'm not genetically linked to Freddie. I call this the Velcro effect, and I talk a lot about this in the donor-conceived community, where you start to stick it onto that particular fertility journey, and you go, actually, no, maybe let's have a think together about what Freddie brings up for you. Is it the fact that you're parenting a boy this time? Is it the fact that you're parenting multiples, and so you're not quite doing it the way you did last time? That feels a bit strange. I also had a gorgeous woman who had twins, and she said to me quite honestly, this wasn't what I imagined. I always just had one baby on my breast, not two. And so it's being honest about that the experiences will be different. It might be that the genetics are part of it, but most likely when you start to unpick this, it's usually a very little percentage of what's happening. And it's more often about being a different type of parent, because let's face it, however our children come to us, we have to be a different parent to each of them. They're not all the same. They're not identikit, people. They all come with their own personalities. You, by virtue of the fact that time passes, are also a different parent. And you'll be a different parent because of your age, because of your experience, because of the gender of your child, because of the temperament of your child. There's a whole load of variables in any family, never mind a blended family, that you could easily point to and go, oh, it's because of the genetic link being lost. And I would argue there's usually a whole load of other factors involved as well. And if you're brave enough, or if you want to, that's where, a team like mine come in, that we can help you unpick what's happening. But the idea that we love every child the same, going to blow that out with the bathwater as well, is nonsense. We love every one of our children differently, but equally.
I think that's such an important message, because I definitely think that, and I do say it, that because the journey that came to bringing the first child into this world, and the first child who gave you that title mummy after so much adversity, the love for Amala, in my case, is definitely different to the love for the triplets, because of that fact that she brought the title mummy and daddy into our household. We wouldn't have it if it wasn't for her. But it doesn't mean it's any less than the other three miracle babies that decide to, finish our family. But it's okay. It's okay to love differently as well.
Absolutely. Do you love all your friends the same? Do you love all your siblings the same? We really need to get, I'm really sick of this. I'm 20 plus years doing this. I feel so guilty. I don't love my daughter. Really? Who else do you love exactly the same? We all love each person in our lives differently. That's the gift of children, that they confront us in different ways, to love them differently.
I always remember a friend at university who was from Sweden, and he talked about how there was a lot of different words for love, and in English we just call it love.
Exactly.
And it then just means that you then can get a little bit confused. Or do I love this person? Do I love this person? But what I feel for this person is different from this person. And it was really interesting just having that conversation, and just realizing that actually in other countries there's multiple words for it, because it feels differently depending on whether it's a friend or a family member, or your first child or your second child.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that.
Gosh, so much to digest after this. I think I need to go and sit in a dark room after this conversation for a little while. I guess we've touched on a lot of this, but my final question, actually, before I lead to that, I'm going to actually share a nugget of something that happened in the past week. This is totally off script, but I was writing a chapter for my book, Julianne, and I ended up going through some of my Instagram comments, and I picked up one that you and I had a talk about. And it was about this conversation, we spoke about it at the top of the podcast, about, what motherhood looks like. And I'd talked about in Hinduism how Krishna's mum hadn't actually given birth to her yet. In my religion, no one's questioned whether she was the mum. She was his mum. She didn't give birth to him, but she was his mum. And you had commented about, in Christianity, in the role of Joseph as Jesus's father figure. And I just wanted to say that, certain things that you impart on us, those nuggets of wisdom, they stay forever. And that's definitely something I go back to whenever I feel like, hold on, if I'm questioning my mother, my role as a mum, is it because of actually I'm just really tired today? Or is it actually because I don't feel like I'm their mum? And most of the time it's nothing to do with whether I feel like their mum or not. It's just, it's just exhausting, this job. And the final question I do have is that, when we do find our motherhood, and our children push our buttons, and it's an exhausting job, it's the gratitude and the grief. Learning how to allow them to live alongside each other is a bit of a struggle. I don't want to moan at people because it's so hard raising triplets plus one, but also I want to moan because it's really, really hard. How do we give ourselves permission to do that?
We have to, I think, shrug aside this martyr mother that so many of us are given, and I think this starts so young. The good girl, the good wife, the good mother, whether we like it or not, and I'm sure we all agree that we're feminists, we take in these ideas of what mothers look like. We each have our own cultural backgrounds. I mean, the Irish mammy is the martyr mother, bar none, and we take these things in unconsciously, and of course we try to emulate them. We are mothers in a society that demands more of us and expects more of us. We read research that scares the living daylights out of us because we're not doing enough of this or enough of that. And yet we all have outside pursuits like jobs and professions and interests. And I mean, really, we really load the mother load far too much at the moment. And so I would say, if you're feeling any of these things around your motherhood, take a step back. Perspective is everything. It's really important that you're not doing this on your own. And I know for a lot of mothers who come to motherhood, in a difficult way, they're constantly trying to prove themselves. You don't have to prove. I have a poem on this, actually. I can maybe send it to you. You can share it on the website. But I have a poem I've written called "You Do Not Have to Prove Yourself Worthy." Because for me, it's often what motherhood, when it comes the hard way, is what we do. We have to constantly prove that we're worthy of these children, that we're the best mum that they could ever have, etc., etc. No. On any given day, your children just need a mother, not a super mom, not not a mother hero. They just need you, and that is the different variances in you as well. I'm really, really really passionate about having mothers be more open about the struggles. We know when we are more open, we get a sense of belonging from each other, and often we feel our shoulders drop when we're speaking to people who go, I get it. And so put the shame to one side, find at least one person who you can be really honest with, reach out to them on a day that's bad, and remember, as Scarlett O'Hara said, there's always tomorrow. That's the great thing about motherhood. You can do it over and over and over again. And remember, you're becoming a different mother for each different stage of your child's life. So you're constantly doing yourself over. Go easy on yourself.
Thank you. Do you know, there's not many conversations I think we've had that have impacted me so much personally, I think. And that I could just have listened to. I think I could have stayed and talked all day, but I've got a sports day to get to, and it's pouring with rain out as well. But no, thank you so much. As I said, we could do multiple podcasts, couldn't we? There's so much to unpack. But I also know how useful our listeners will find that episode. Just because I know how useful I found it.
It's been lovely, and I'm sure we'll do lots more as we get the courses up and running. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Julianne.
You're really welcome. And in whatever way I can help, if people want to reach out to me via Parenthood in Mind, that's absolutely fine. And obviously
Yeah,
for you guys, I'd love to speak to you more about the courses, because I'm very
of course.
passionate about really opening up these topics for intended parents.
For sure, for sure. We will definitely sort of be tagging you on the Instagram posts, and we'll have you detailed on the website as well. So thank
Thank you.
you for joining us today.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Take care.